In the late 1970s, Chrysler was on the brink of financial ruin, and Lee Iacocca, as you can see here, had to go before the U.S. Congress and ask for the government to provide $1.5 billion in federal loan guarantees in order to keep Chrysler afloat. Iacocca would prove successful and get those loan guarantees, and Chrysler would get a second shot at life, one that it certainly didn't waste. With the appropriate funds, Chrysler would end up launching the K-Cars, which, while today they look kind of boxy and extremely ordinary, well, they did provide Chrysler with a new product and really the right product at the right time. Consumers during this era were trying to find more efficient vehicles that were downsized and could allow them to pinch pennies, but also not be so cramped on the inside that people had to travel without some sense of comfort on the roadways. And the K-Cars really did fit that bill. But perhaps what Chrysler was most successful with was the introduction of the minivan in 1984, a concept that actually Lee Iacocca and Hal Sperlich had pioneered at Ford back in the 1970s with the Minimax, but Ford never bought into it, thinking that the Minimax might hamper what were then profitable station wagon sales. So Chrysler was first to the market in the U.S. in 1984 with its minivan, and it really created a new segment overnight that just took off. Families loved the minivan because it had so much room on the inside, and what's amazing is if you see one of these Chrysler minivans today, just how small they really are. They're about the size of a Honda Civic, actually even smaller than a Honda Civic in terms of overall length, and yet you could fit 7 passengers in there with relative comfort. Now, you had relative comfort, but you didn't necessarily have a lot of power under hood. The early minivans just had the Chrysler 2.2-liter four-cylinder or the optional Mitsubishi 2.6-liter four-cylinder under hood. They later get V6 engines and much more power and even a turbocharged four-cylinder option. Beyond the minivan, though, Chrysler would take the K-Car platform to a number of extremes and would introduce so many different variants based upon it that David E. Davis Jr., who was then editor-in-chief of Car and Driver, once remarked that it seems that Chrysler had their finger stuck on the K key in terms of all the product development. But you got to give them credit. They really reused this platform and made it in different lengths and in different sizes to have all different types of vehicles in the market. Everything, as I've said, from the minivan to the Plymouth Reliant to even the Imperial, which was on a stretched K-Car chassis, maybe even too stretched because the body was pretty flexible on those. But as the 1980s would wear on, the styling that Chrysler had really employed, that 3-box design with the upright C-pillar, upright A-pillar, and very airy greenhouse really was just getting kind of tired looking, and they needed something different in the marketplace. By the way, for those who are wondering, the K-Cars were designed under the leadership of Don De La Rosa, whom Lee Iacocca had brought over from Ford Motor Company. And you can kind of see that in the designs with how boxy they are and how flat the fenders are, as well as the quarter panels. It's very Ford-esque, and that was kind of a trademark of Don De La Rosa, who I would say he admittedly loved the K-Cars, and I guess there was reason to because they sold pretty well. But when it comes to being a time period like around 1987 and you're still making cars like the Plymouth Reliant or even the Dodge 600, this very sporty European vehicle that has found its way to the junkyard, let's say, the buying public was just starting to sour on some of Chrysler's products by this point yet again. And it needed to reinvent itself, and in particular its styling, such that it could take the next step forward. Enter the vehicle that we will now discuss, the Chrysler-Lamborghini Portofino concept. Now remember, during this time frame, Chrysler owned Lamborghini, and it was one of those things I think Lee Iacocca just really wanted to own an Italian sports car company because, after all, he was Italian, and Lamborghini was certainly a well-known name in the marketplace at that time. So Chrysler ended up buying Lamborghini. Chrysler would, in fact, end up owning Lamborghini for a relatively brief period of time, specifically April 1987 through January of 1994. And as you can imagine, by January 1994, Lee Iacocca was gone, and I think that Chrysler leadership thought it was time to move on from Lamborghini. But Lamborghini did team up with Chrysler on a number of things, including helping Chrysler engineer the Viper engine, the Viper V10, and casting the aluminum block for it. So it was a tie-up that did yield some fruit, including, though, this Chrysler Portofino concept. Take one look at the Portofino, and you can tell that it was nothing like what Chrysler was producing in 1987. And amazingly, while this car was kind of a hybrid Chrysler-Lamborghini project, including it running on a stretched Yalpa chassis and being powered by a mid-mounted 3.5-liter V8 engine from Lamborghini, the design was all from the Chrysler team. It was designed by Kevin Verdoyen of the Chrysler Studios, and just take a look at how revolutionary this car is for 1987, particularly with Chrysler products. Now remember, Chrysler during this time was producing those vehicles with the stiff and upright A-pillars and C-pillars, and we'll call it cab rearward design. The Portofino instead was really one of the first cars for Chrysler that pioneered this cab forward design. In other words, that front windshield touches down pretty far forward on the car as opposed to further rearward, and that gives the cabin a feeling of openness and airiness. You'll also notice that there really are no boxes here. This is not a boxy car at all, and instead, the car is really just one contiguous shape. And if one were to describe the overall shape of the car, I think that's what you would say, that it really is just one contiguous form all the way around, albeit the hood cut line there looks a little bit misaligned. But this car did survive an accident in the early 1990s, I believe, and Chrysler had to have it restored at a cost of about $300,000 because it was so severely damaged in a transit accident. Now, as we rotate around to the side view, you see a number of distinguishing features. First of all, take a look at the wheel covers. You have the Lamborghini logo, because as I mentioned, this was the Chrysler-Lamborghini Portofino. And interestingly, the car was debuted at the Frankfurt Auto Show in 1987, almost contemporaneous with Chrysler's acquisition of Lamborghini. You'll also see the windows, the front side glass has this little cutout for the window that can drop down into the door. The window was so curved and had so much curvature toward the roofline that there was no way that you could drop that glass into the door. You had to have just that little section, kind of like a DeLorean, that would go down. And I guess the rear doors don't have any glass that goes down, so you better hope that your air conditioner is working. We'll talk about how those doors open in a second, but they're scissor doors, really like the Diablo. And the Diablo was a car that was developed by Lamborghini while it was part of Chrysler. You also have an extremely low hood line and cowl, and the front of the car is very, very low. But notice that the belt line on the side is lower than the cowl, and that was a trend that actually continued from the 1980s, where designers were trying to make the cabins feel open and airy. So they gave a lot of cars this low belt line, something that you don't see today, and I think I really wish that it would come back, because it makes the car feel so much more open and airy when that belt line is lower than when it's much higher like it is on many of today's cars. And beyond that, you have this super glassy upper. It is true that the A-pillar on this car is clearly a little bit chunkier than normal, but the B-pillar and the rest of the car, the B-pillar is relatively thin, and you can see designers blacked it out, so it looks like you have kind of one continuous glass plane on the side of the vehicle and that wraps around the back, which we're going to take a look at in a second. So a lot was really new on this vehicle, and I think probably the most seminal part of this was that cab forward design with the windshield touchdown that's basically almost aligned with the center line of the front wheels, at least it appears to be in this picture. Now, as we make our way around to the rear of the car, some people say that it looks like a Dodge Stealth, and maybe there's a little bit of that. But again, you can see this super glassy upper, and it looks like the designers blacked out the C-pillar trims as well. So it gives you this visual appearance of the car having a floating roof as well as just a huge amount of glass area. That was one of the great things about the concept cars of the 80s, was that large amount of glass. Out back, you have what appears to be little vent holes that are cut in the fascia, and that probably helps the Yalpa V8 to get rid of some of the hot air back there. But you do have a wall-to-wall tail lamp, a very thin wall-to-wall tail lamp, and this spoiler that is interestingly placed right up against the backlight, as opposed to further rearward on the car, where it could actually produce more downforce, I would say. Here, it's kind of over the rear wheel center line, and it looks cool. I guess I'm admittedly not sure how functional it is. Of course, you have the dual exhaust tips for the Lamborghini V8, which produced around 255 horsepower and 230 pound-feet of torque. The horsepower doesn't sound like a lot nowadays, but if you were cracking 200 horsepower back during this time frame, that was a lot. Remember, Corvettes in the 80s didn't really have much more than for the 1984 Corvette, only had 205 horsepower. Then it got a little bit more with the tune-port injection that came in 1985, but 255 horsepower is actually pretty good. I'll also just call out this very flat deck lid and quarter profile from the rear, helping accentuate the width, and the width is also accentuated by those strakes that have the vents included in them and that wall-to-wall tail lamp. So the car kind of espouses this longer, lower, wider theme. Remember I mentioned it's based on a stretch Yalpa chassis. It's certainly low, and the designers are trying to give it visual cues to help the width. No fender peaks here, just kind of one continuous form all the way around. And notice there's really no creases on this car. The body sides are clean, the deck lid is clean, the quarters are clean. There's some, I would say air vents and things in the lower section, but overall, really a no-line car, so to speak. There's, again, not really a crease to be found. And that was pretty revolutionary, especially when you contrast that with the K car, which is one big crease, or the General Motors vehicles of the mid and early 1980s that are kind of one big crease with the sheer look. This is the antithesis of the sheer look from GM that really was initiated with the 1976 to 79 Seville. And I think this even takes a car like the 1986 Ford Taurus to an entirely different level in terms of just being so clear and clean. But the Taurus and this car do share some things in common, including that very glassy upper and that flat deck lid and the wall-to-wall tail lamps in some cases on like the Mercury Sable variant of that particular car. And in case you were wondering how the doors open on this vehicle, well, it's got the double scissor doors on either side. Kind of similar opening to Lamborghinis of the era, and certainly exotic. Never really caught on with the buying public, though, those scissor-style doors, although some Teslas have something a little similar, but certainly not like this. Now, given the dramatic exterior, I would have hoped for a little bit more drama on the inside of the Portofino. It's not a bad-looking interior. It's actually very open and airy. You have this full-length center console. We'll take a look at the steering wheel in a second because it has the Chrysler Pentastar and then the Lamborghini Bull inside of it. Kind of reminds me of what Chrysler did in terms of the logo with the TC by Maserati, that Chrysler Maserati, or the Chrysler Pentastar that surrounded the Maserati Trident. It's a busy logo overall, but I guess it makes sense when you think about, well, what this car really was. Now, you can see there's also a manual transmission. This car borrowed the Yalpa's 5-speed manual transmission, so that's part of the center console. And I guess this was getting to the early 90s, at least to be the early 90s in the not-too-distant future. So these bright colors like this yellow piping and yellow on the steering wheel and the shifter just made sense. Here's another close-up of the instrument panel, and you can see one thing that's kind of cool about this is that the stereo system in that instrument panel is raked forward pretty significantly. Now, that wouldn't be great for ergonomics. You can imagine sitting in the driver's seat trying to reach for the radio controls probably isn't that great, although there are a fair number of controls that are surrounding the steering wheel, kind of within a finger's length on the instrument cluster binnacle there that contains the speedometer as well as the other instruments. So Chrysler was in some ways thinking about ergonomics, but they didn't want the steering wheel clustered with buttons like on Pontiac. So they just put buttons on the eyepiece surround, I guess, and you could reach them with your finger from the wheel. And here's one last look of the interior. You can see that Chrysler Pentastar with the Lamborghini Bull in the middle of the steering wheel. A bunch of generic buttons on the steering wheel. Not clear what they're for. I'm sure that the marketing brochure of the day said that it was cruise control or some active setup. I doubt that they are functional. And you can see the buttons surrounding the IP on the driver's side here as well. The climate control is interestingly on the center console, and pretty awkward reach to kind of reach back and change the climate control. But I doubt it's functional for a concept car like this. So now that we've discussed the interior, let's discuss the impact of the Portofino on Chrysler's lineup. Well, while the Portofino was never produced, certain styling elements of it were, I would say, taken by Chrysler and placed on concept cars. Most notably, the first-generation LH cars, the Dodge Intrepid, the Chrysler LHS, although the LHS did have a significantly different rear with that Jaguar-esque C-pillar. The Eagle Vision, they just were fantastic-looking vehicles. Even the Chrysler Concorde had some of the Portofino in it. Unfortunately, those LH cars weren't necessarily the best when it came to quality, but they did look cool. And I would say the next-generation cloud cars, the Cirrus in particular, as well as the Stratus, had some of these elements of the Portofino, including the cab-forward styling. So the Portofino, while it was never produced, certainly had an impact on Chrysler design for its production vehicles for many, many years to come. What do you think of the Portofino concept? Put a comment in the comment section and let me know. Thanks again for watching.